I'll wait until we have a few more chairs for everybody to sit down. Anyway, it's really nice to see so many of you here. Thanks for coming. We are the Multicultural Alliance, and we're excited to be able to present these great panelists for you tonight to discuss privilege in education. The Multicultural Alliance is a student organization that aims to unite the University of Montana students, staff, faculty, and administrators in developing a more diverse and welcome campus community. Through town hall meetings, intergroup dialogue classes, and co-sponsoring events with other student organizations, among other things, we seek to foster diversity and unity on the University of Montana campus. We have a few announcements before we get started. Restrooms are located down the hall. I'm sure everybody knows. We will try to have a short bathroom break after the presentation. We would also like to let you know that Montana Cable Access Television is taping tonight, so if your friends missed it or if you want to see it again, keep an eye out for the schedule and you'll be able to watch it again. As a reminder, everybody loves reruns. As a reminder, please turn your cell phones off, and if you think you need to answer a call, sit on one of the ends or the aisle, and then you don't have to step over people. And lastly, we base our town hall meeting topics on your suggestions and requests, so please fill out the eval cards inserted in your programs and put them in a basket or give them to one of us. Thank you very much.
It's my distinct pleasure to be able to have this last town hall meeting of the semester be on privilege in education. I am graduating this year with a master's in social work, and I really wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, and I think I'm about to do that. And I would like to acknowledge all of you for coming out tonight. A lot of times when we think of privilege, we think of blame and guilt and preachiness and self-righteousness. And I am here to say that's not going to be the case tonight, but I admire your courage for possibly showing up for something like that. For many of us, privilege is a real difficult concept to understand because it's like asking a fish about water. How can I speak of water when it's the only thing I've ever known, and I haven't known anything about fire or air? I have nothing to compare water to. All of us have areas of privilege and disadvantage. So it's really important that we take a look at the full complexity of our areas of privilege and disadvantage, because it'll help us be more effective people in the world. What many of us may not have realized about privilege is that privilege comes at great cost, not only to the disadvantaged groups, but to the privileged groups as well. And so I'm hoping that you'll begin to explore possibilities and a deeper understanding of the costs that come with privilege and why it's important to know about where your privilege is unacknowledged. So tonight we have three presenters, stellar individuals, all of them. I chose them, so I think they are. Sergio Romero is a professor in sociology, and he teaches classes like, I'm going to have to check my notes here, race, gender, and class, social theory, and social stratification. And his primary research interests are network and content analyses of power networks engaged in public policy, the political economy of immigrant labor, and the impact of social welfare policy on inequality. In the middle is Julie Cajun. She's the director of the Tribal History Project at Salish Kootenai College. And in the past, she taught kindergarten through fourth grade, high school, and education courses at Salish Kootenai College. And during her teaching experience, she began to search for materials to represent Indian people humanely and authentically. Finding they were non-existent, she began to create them for her own classroom and then for others. According to Julie, her experience has been a remarkable journey through humility, tragedy, racism, justice, and celebration. And finally, we have Brian Cochran. He's a professor in the psychology department here at the University of Montana, and his primary area of research interest is in the health correlates of being part of a stigmatized minority group. Specifically, he has studied substance use disorders and other psychopathologies of sexual minorities, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender individuals. All of this is framed within a contextual model that takes into account the unique experiences of identifying as part of a marginalized segment of society. So without further ado, I would like to start with Brian Cochran, if that's all right.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm going to do a little bit of technological magic because I have...
We hope.
We hope. So I was really pleased to be invited to give this talk this evening, to talk on heterosexual privilege. It's something I haven't talked on before, but I'd like to thank the Multicultural Alliance for inviting me to join this.
Can you move your mic closer, please?
I sure could. Does that increase mine? Here we go. So I'd like to apologize in advance to American Express for the title of my talk. I'm borrowing a tagline of theirs. The talk is called Heterosexuality, Membership Has Its Privileges. So this is, of course, a play on the term heterosexual privilege. Heterosexual privilege, as Niraja was referring to, isn't necessarily a term intended to evoke guilt or misunderstanding. It's a term used to describe, like you were saying, the experience of a fish who's always lived in water. Most of us don't think about what it means to be heterosexual in society, so I'm going to ask you to do that over the next few minutes. Perhaps in reading the title here, you may have had a couple of different reactions. Membership has its privileges. You may have had reactions such as, I didn't choose to be heterosexual. I was born straight. It's not a privilege I worked for. Or even, I have many friends who are gay and lesbian. Surely you're not talking to me. But what I'd like you to do is put these immediate reactions that you might have aside and to think about what it means to be heterosexual for the next few minutes. To think about what it means to be heterosexual in the 21st century, in the US, and certainly in Missoula, Montana. Now, heterosexual privilege as a concept has many different related terms. I'm going to talk about each of these and distinguish them from one another. The first is homophobia. You may be more familiar with the construct of homophobia. Homophobia means the fear or hatred of people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. I'm going to use the acronym LGBT to refer to lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. It sounds like a sandwich, but it's just a shorter way of saying those four terms. So what is meant by homophobia? It's not the same as heterosexual privilege, although people who are homophobic certainly often fail to recognize the privileges that are afforded to them by virtue of being heterosexual. Another related term by Chris Ingram is called thinking straight. She's a sociologist and women's studies scholar, and she refers to thinking straight as viewing the world from a heterosexual perspective, without questioning what it might mean to live outside of the heterosexual mainstream. The famous writer Adrienne Rich refers to a term, compulsory heterosexuality. This is the pervasive norm in society that involves the expectation that boys will love girls, women will grow up and marry men, and anyone who goes against these principles will be considered an outcast. Compulsory heterosexuality is political. It's conceived of as a powerful social movement that excludes LGBT individuals based on their sexual preferences or gender identities. Now, by contrast, heterosexual privilege is personal. Its nature as a personal construct makes it apt for self-reflection, the very type of self-reflection that I'm asking you to do for the next few minutes. Now, throughout my discussion, I'm going to enumerate privileges afforded to people who identify as heterosexual by enumerating the rights and abilities that are afforded to people by virtue of this social construct. I'll be referring to constructs that happen in the 21st century in the politically divided United States and, of course, in scenic Missoula, Montana. I'm going to be referencing a list of privileges that's been compiled by Peggy McIntosh, who has written extensively on white privilege. You may have seen some of her quotes up on the screen before I began, and they've also been adapted by a local psychologist, Jennifer Robon. So, to continue, heterosexuality, membership has its social privileges. The statements I'll list are from the perspective of a heterosexual person reflecting on heterosexual privileges in society. I can walk down the street holding hands with my partner without fear of criticism or harm. Now, displays of affection for LGBT individuals become much more than a mere expression between partners. They are perceived as a political statement, or worse, as an invitation to attack by others. Can you all hear me in the back there? Okay, but not on TV. All right. According to statistics compiled by the FBI, in 2005, 14.2% of the 7,160 hate crime incidents reported were committed based on a bias against the victim's sexual orientation. That's about 1,000 incidents in that 1 year alone. Of course, this statistic refers to reported hate crimes only. People who are members of a stigmatized minority group are less likely to report such incidents due to fears of misunderstanding by police, concerns that the crimes will not be taken seriously, or often legitimate fears that those investigating the incident will blame the person for having flaunted his or her sexuality and thereby provoking such incidents. Consequently, although over 1,000 hate crimes were reported in 2005, it is likely that far more incidents of individuals being victimized based on their sexual orientations actually occurred. You don't need to look far to think about hate crime bias here in Missoula, Montana based on sexual orientation. Of course, highly publicized in the previous year were two men being attacked on the Head Strip downtown based on people perceiving that they may be gay. When I go to college, I do not have to fear rejection by my roommates, hallmates, or classmates because of my sexual orientation. As you all know, there's enough to think about when starting college without having to fear that your sexual orientation will become an issue on campus. LGBT students face the very real fear of discrimination, rejection, or physical harm on a daily basis. If I'm a person of faith, I can be confident that I will find a community that does not exclude or condemn people of my sexual orientation. Now, by contrast, LGBT individuals need to do just a bit more research before picking a particular religious community. Biases may be overt or subtle. Whereas some religious organizations explicitly state that they do not accept gay or lesbian members into their congregations, others may accept them, but with an ultimate goal of converting them to heterosexuality, or may allow gay and lesbian members to attend religious services as long as they don't speak of their sexual orientation openly to others. Of course, many religious organizations do openly welcome people regardless of sexual orientation, but again, there is no guarantee. By contrast, and thinking again about heterosexual privilege, there are few, if any, circumstances in which religious heterosexuals should fear attending a church because they may be expected to turn gay, or to keep quiet about having children because it fears that heterosexuals are more likely to be pedophiles or child molesters. If I've made a life commitment to my partner, I can wear a wedding ring to symbolize the event and comfortably tell anyone who asks about its significance. For many LGBT individuals in committed relationships, announcing such a commitment is tantamount to making a political statement. Why does she have to tell everyone about it? Or, it's okay for him to live that kind of lifestyle. I just don't want to have to hear about it because I get these images in my mind. These are common reactions to the so-called political event of gay and lesbian individuals discussing their relationships in public. I can assure you, relationships are difficult enough to navigate, as we all know, even with the support of family, friends, and the greater society. LGBT individuals don't enter into partnerships to make some sort of political statement. They do so for the same reasons as everyone else, to share their lives with a partner, because they're in love, or because they may prefer a relationship to being single. heterosexuality does, in fact, come with social privileges. Next, I want to talk a little bit more about economic privileges. If I have a health insurance policy, I have the option of including my life partner on that policy, and inclusion of my partner will come without penalty. For example, the policy will not be considered taxable income. Many of the benefits that are built into our jobs, our tax structure, and into the US economy are fundamentally heterosexual in nature. Exceptions to this are to be commended, but certainly do not come without cost. Many of you probably remember the policy of domestic partner benefits being one here at the University of Montana for faculty and staff over the previous couple of years. But this was a hard-won policy, and it was achieved through expensive legal assistance, diligent documentation, making a case for these benefits, and significant opposition from many people in the community. These benefits were ultimately won, but not without considerable debate, negotiations with reluctant insurance providers, and a case of arson, in which two women supporting these benefits had their home destroyed. If you are heterosexual, imagine having to go through these hurdles in order to ensure that your partner has health insurance in the event of a medical crisis. When I go to sign a lease or apply for a mortgage, I need not be concerned that I may be denied because of my sexual orientation. You may never have scrutinized non-discrimination documents that come when you sign a lease or a mortgage or something like that. But I do routinely, not because it's a personal hobby of mine, but because it's important. It really does make a difference to know that a company does or does not discriminate based on sexual orientation. When I die, my Social Security benefits will go to my life partner, and she or he will automatically inherit my assets under probate laws. Now, I realize that few of us, regardless of sexual orientation, are really counting on Social Security to be there for us.
Amen.
But what I want to point out is the automatically part of this statement. It's automatically the case that benefits do go to people's opposite sex partners if they are legally married. But there are no such automatic arrangements for people who are LGBT. Ensuring that your partner will receive your assets, for many people, means finding an attorney who is aware of the needs of LGBT clients and thereby planning accordingly. Heterosexuality, membership has its health privileges. Now, my training, as you mentioned, is as a clinical psychologist, and my specific area of research involves looking at the mental health characteristics of people who identify as LGBT, as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. LGBT individuals live in a society in which there are few positive role models. They are asked by others, often well-meaning, why they chose their sexual orientation or gender identity. Meeting other LGBT people is complicated not only by fears of harassment or maltreatment, but by a sheer numbers game. It's difficult for LGBT people to meet others for friendships or romantic relationships, and when they do, the context is often in a bar or a nightclub. Given these struggles, it's not surprising that LGBT individuals endorse higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicidality than their heterosexual peers. If I seek mental health services, I do not have to worry that, as opposed to say, my counselor will see my sexual orientation as pathological or offer me, quote, reparative therapy. Homosexuality was considered to be a psychiatric illness until 1974, just over 30 years ago. Vestiges of this pathology view of homosexuality still remain, and there are still therapists who practice so-called reparative therapy, despite all evidence indicating that this so-called treatment actually makes people worse and is unethical in terms of its practice. If you identify as heterosexual or straight, imagine that the world was heterophobic and that you're going to see a therapist for something like anxiety, depression, or other psychological symptoms. And imagine that you might be confronted by your mental health provider regarding your straightness. Have you tried same-sex relationships? This person might say. Perhaps you need to have a positive sexual experience with someone of the same sex in order to overcome your attraction to the opposite sex. Maybe you don't know what you're missing. Or, we know that some people become heterosexual because they're raised in families with an overprotective mother and a distant father. This may sound preposterous. Why would anyone want to convert someone from being straight to being gay or lesbian? My hope is that in reflecting on this concept of heterosexual privilege, you'll question the assumptions of normative heterosexuality, and you'll see discrimination against LGBT individuals as just as preposterous. In health class, I was provided with information about my sexuality, health, and safety that was pertinent to and essential for individuals of my sexual orientation. Heterosexuality is not relegated to a footnote in sexuality class. It's not accompanied by awkward laughter and jokes. It isn't discussed as an alternative lifestyle and explained only in the context of HIV. It doesn't invoke the ire of parents who want to be sure that their children don't have to hear about heterosexuality. Rich Savin-Williams, a psychologist who's done a lot of research in this area, has estimated, based on interviews with hundreds of gay men, that the average gay male became aware of his sexual orientation at around age 8. There are few safe places for an 8-year-old who realizes that he may be gay, and sex education class certainly is not one of them. If I become ill and need to be hospitalized, my life partner will be allowed to visit me in the hospital, and his or her wishes concerning my health care will be consulted and respected. According to an article by Tina Sussman, 4 years ago, a Baltimore jury rejected a claim by Bill Flanagan, age 38 of San Francisco, who sued Baltimore's Shock Trauma Center of the University of Maryland after it didn't let him visit his partner, 32-year-old Robert Daniel, as he died of AIDS in that hospital. By the time he finally got into the hospital room, his partner had lost consciousness and never regained it, and they never had a chance to say goodbye. The hospital, of course, denied accusations of discrimination. Heterosexuality membership has its privileges. I've focused on 3 different domains of that privilege: social, economic, and health. I could continue to discuss legal, political, and other privileges as well. Instead, I'd like to issue a challenge to you. Regardless of your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your relationship status, I'm asking you to simply pay attention. The next time you hear someone make a gay or lesbian slur, imagine what you might feel like if it were directed towards you. You won't have to wait long for this to happen. When you fill out forms the next time you go to a physician's office, notice the options for relationship status. They're probably going to say married, single, never married, divorced, and possibly other. Think about how you'd answer this if you didn't fit into any of these categories. Think about what it would be like to mark through the options and to write in and then a same-sex relationship. Imagine how that would make you feel. If you are heterosexual, I want to be clear that I don't want you to give up the rights and benefits afforded to you by virtue of being heterosexual. I certainly wouldn't. The goal is not to relinquish heterosexual privilege, but to recognize it. When you see all the things that I've mentioned tonight as part of a privilege given to people by virtue of their being born heterosexual, perhaps you'll see things a little bit differently. I'm not asking for special rights, I just want you to consider a new perspective. Thank you for listening.
I don't make too much noise when I go to switch here.
Turn it off while you're flipping it on.
That's a novel idea.
We have period for questions and answers and group discussion. And the index cards that are inserted in your program.
How's that? you hear me back there? Nope, not at all. Okay, can you hear me? Nope.
Quickly.
Okay.
Do we test?
Okay, can you hear me? Oh, good. That feels better for me, so I'm not hovering over this thing. Am I next? Okay, are we going this way? Are we going in order? Okay, all right. Well, Cheschaluch Pesia Isala. I see friends and relatives. Chin Lempthu Ethwichtaman. I'm so happy that you're here. I know most of you are here. Who's here for extra credit? Right, okay. That's okay. We have a captive audience, so we'll just take advantage of you then. So I want to start this evening by recognizing this place where we are. Intlai Stem. This is the place of small bull trout. Anybody know that? Specifically, it's referring to the Missoula area, but where the rattlesnake flows into the Clark Fork River. And I wanted to do that to remind myself and to remind you that this land, right here where we are, was part of a really old tribal world, a sacred landscape of my Salish ancestors. And it was a place that was intimately known and affectionately known for many things, including its abundance of bitterroot. The Missoula area was a favorite place for people to come and dig bitterroot. And there's some beautiful historic photos of people camped and digging bitterroot. And it's just about ready. So if any of you are up in our area, we will be having our bitterroot feast soon. Unfortunately, the fields of bitterroot that were here are now parking lots and roads. So now that I've really bummed you out, I want to try to encourage you and encourage myself and remember the tradition of my relatives and to share a poem with you to introduce the concept that I'd like to talk about. And this poem I'm using as a way of prayer, and it's from Joy Harjo. And it seems like I'm always starting with Joy Harjo, aren't I? And this poem is called Remember. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father, his hands cradling your mother's flesh, and maybe her heart too, and maybe not. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, black earth, we are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of the universe. Remember you are this universe and that this universe is you. Remember all is motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance that language is, that life is. Remember to remember. We live in a country that seems unable to remember. A nation in a constant state of intentional or voluntary amnesia. And what is a country without memory? A juvenile power, drunk with the thirst of reinventing itself over and over, designing itself as a grown-up with imagined integrity and moral right. Inventions, designs, and imaginations have been authorized and institutionalized as knowledge, as science, and as history. But on the margins and out there in the borderlands of the illusion of the national identity and history exists the very real story of the racial history of America. And this story begins with a crime. The taking of land and killing of people, conquest, colonialism, imperialism, slavery, genocide, segregation. You may have seen glimpses of this history, and perhaps they were characterized by these neutral or positive slogans. Westward expansion, or the ever favorite, the Columbian Exchange. I think that's my personal favorite. Doesn't that kind of make you think about at work, at Christmas time, let's have a gift exchange, and you get a secret name or something? The Columbian Exchange was hardly that. And I'm certain that there are those of us here this evening that know well of what I'm talking about. And I really don't want to belabor that we already know. However, I would like to give emphasis to the contemporary, to the now situation, current, now, just 2 days ago, I think. The perpetuation of imagined history and the practice of colonialism by sharing this recent example. At the request of an editorial staff working on a history project, I was given material to review in regard to the historic accuracy related to the Salish people. Well, the first thing I noticed when I looked at it was the ever popular Bering-Land Bridge theory, another one of my personal favorites. Can you see the map? Here's Asia, there are the dots that go into Alaska. Can you see it from our history books? Well, when questioning the validity of its inclusion and the place of prominence in the text, I noted to the staff the current scholarship that dates human habitation in the Americas 35,000 to 50,000 years ago. And more recently, I was reading, people are saying perhaps 100,000 years ago. I also mentioned the need to consider where were human populations in Asia at this time. They were living 2 mountain ranges in the interior, and they were following a river north and south. So to get to the shore, to the bridge, they would have had to leave a known food source. We're talking about subsistence living 12,000 years ago, right? Travel over the mountain ranges and then wait on the shore. When the land bridge appeared, then they would cross onto a glacial ice sheet that would have been Alaska. And that would have presented quite a challenge for these adventurous travelers to live and survive. The response I received began with an acknowledgement that the person did not have any knowledge of the peopling of the Americas and would depend on the other writers' research and the advice of an archaeologist. The last comment stated that people of goodwill agree to disagree. So I am to disregard my own tribal oral history that tells me how I came to be where I am and accept a scientific, more academic history is stated of an archaeologist as a significant statement for the peopling of America. I've seen the science of archaeology, the taking of human remains and personal belongings of grandmothers and children to play games of clue, and I do not trust their intentions or their purposes. If I disagree to agree to disagree, did you get that? Okay. Am I a person of bad will? So what will happen now? Well, the text is going to be published as is. There will be some mention and inclusion of alternative tribal oral histories, but to what extent or in what context, I don't know. Edward Said refers to such a process as a Western discourse about the other, which is supported by institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. Well, folks, we are the inheritors of this history of America and these contemporary practices. So what then are we to do when faced with the actions of power and privilege and a continued state of denial about the history of America? This must be one of our challenges for discussion this evening. I believe we first must know and understand this history and engage in truth-telling, becoming warriors of truth, as a Mohawk scholar put it. We must speak the truth to others, and we must speak the truth to power. We must be uncooperative with colonialism. What are some ways that we can do that? Are there issues right here on this campus? I bet George Price could come up with a few. I won't put him on the spot to do so. What about the university model? I'll bring that up again. The discovery continues. Coined on the eve of the bicentennial of Lewis and Clark, does that perpetuate colonial ideology and dismiss the reality of invasion and the interests of commerce? Lewis and Clark were on a business trip. Vine Deloria stated that academia has been a hotbed of racism because scholars are sometimes taught to pretend that they can observe phenomena objectively. In fact, they observe data through culturally prescribed categories that restrict the possible answers and understandings to a predetermined few selections. We must engage in supporting Indigenous people in seeking alternatives to the indignity of cultural assimilation and political surrender. How can we do that? We can start by rejecting generations of false memory and expect and support voices and stories from the other. In fact, there are those doing that now. Howard Zinn, Ronald Takaki, Angela Wilson, Noam Chomsky, Elizabeth Cook Lynn. I could go on, there's a long list. But their work seems to remain in the borderlands of academia. When do students get to read their work? When do you get to read their work? Do we continue the status quo in K-12, the Bering Land Bridge, Columbus, Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims? Do we continue that, and then when students get to college, just blow their minds? I don't know. What are we going to do? What stories and history, I'm asking you, what stories and history should everyone know in America? What should we know? What is essential to know? I believe that in hearing other narratives, in knowing about Wounded Knee and Sand Creek and people like Zitkala Sa and Quilix and many others, that we can find courage to reclaim the memory of this country. And when we do that together, we create a collective and shared understanding. It's not mine, it's ours. And that when we do that, we can decide what our chapter of history is going to be. We're making history now. Anybody know we're making history? Even if we don't recognize it, even if we're not aware of it. Montana and Montanans have begun the difficult work of remembering. It started in 1972. The Constitutional Convention. All of those delegates were non-Indian. There was not one Indian in that Constitutional Convention. But those delegates remembered the original people of this country. That is powerful and visionary and very courageous for 1972. And they said, the state of Montana recognizes a unique and distinct heritage of American Indians and is committed in its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural integrity. Wow, that's a powerful statement. I'm very proud of that. I don't think there's any other state constitution in the United States that has such a statement. So then we had a law that came about that said, we're going to interpret the intention of the language because that constitutional guarantee was never fulfilled. And that's why today in Montana, we can still ask a crowd of people, can you name the tribes of Montana? Can you tell me something about treaty law? Can you tell me how many tribes are Indian Reorganization Act tribes? Can you tell me what tribal sovereignty is? Can you tell me our names for ourselves? Do you know that there aren't any flatheads? I mean, we could go on and on and on. You know, it's everybody's right. We have a right to be literate about the place where we live. That's our right. The legislature, unfortunately, has gutted Indian education, even though several years ago there was a lawsuit saying the state was not adequately funding public schools, and they included Indian education. Well, I was on the Indian Ed Board then, and we said, hey, if you're going to include us, we would like to be able to make a statement, which we did. And the judge said the strongest part of that lawsuit was the indictment that the state has never funded that constitutional guarantee. It has never supported teachers or schools or people in the state to learn in an authentic and meaningful way about Indian people. There are 7 Indian reservations in Montana. There are so many Indian people in this state. And I have neighbors that have been there 3 generations and still what we know about each other is very limited. When we create a collective and shared understanding, it's an act of spirit and an act of love. And when our gracious host talked about privilege, the privileged and the disadvantaged both are in a state of being dehumanized. Because anybody that is in a position where they are in a dominant group and another group is not, they are dehumanized also. And so acts of resistance are acts of love for everybody. And these are the actions of warriors. And this is the challenge that we're called to each day as we make personal and political choices. Or we can remain silent and immobile. That's an act also, an act of compliance. I'm proud of our state constitution. I believe the delegates were brave and visionary people. They noted the human obligation to the original people of this land, and also the obligation to the land itself and the inherent right of human beings to live in a healthy place. What we do with this opportunity, and we have a unique opportunity here in Montana right now, it's our personal choice. The task can't be left up to policy and public programs. It must become the work and commitment of the people. And it can no longer be the desire and passion only of Indian people. It must be the cause of each human. Whether privileged or oppressed, each are in a dehumanized state. And all and any act of resistance serves to restore our collective humanity. And until we restore our collective humanity, it remains fragile. We can choose to discover a liberatory framework for living. So my challenge to you is to make this your issue and your agenda. It's been an Indian agenda. Indian people have been running for legislature. They've been getting on school boards. Indian parents, grandparents, my mother, I can go back and tell you, all of the yayas and the silas and the sahapas and the kenas that have been advocates for their children to be somewhere that recognizes who they are. Can you imagine going through school and never having yourself represented ever? Or if you are, it's only with Lewis and Clark or Thanksgiving or Columbus. And what you learned at home was different, and you're trying to tell the teacher, wait a minute. Excuse me, I have a correction. I did that in 7th grade in Anaconda. I was put out in the hall. But the challenge for us in Montana, I guess, is to recognize the situation that we're in, that there is a law, Montana Code Annotated 20-1-501, that interpreted that constitutional language that says that schools will provide this information. How are schools going to do that? They have to partner with Indian communities. How is that going to happen? We have to build some trust and understanding. And that isn't done through policies or programs or laws. That's done through people. And so every person, you know, there's a saying, never underestimate what a single act of integrity can accomplish. And so that's what I would challenge all of us to do. Lam lamsh, husuketh kukani, she hoi.
I'd also like to thank the Multicultural Alliance for inviting me here to talk once again. What I'm going to talk about is the relationship between an institution and a set of social relations. The institution being education and the set of social relations being class. First off, on education, education provides a social function. It's not unique to this country. It's replicated throughout the world, especially in industrialized countries. And one of the functions of education is literacy, like the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It also has sort of the mandate to teach something about civic responsibility and how the government works and what our role is as a member of this society. In addition, one of the functions of education is to prepare workers for tomorrow, for the next generation. And that is to provide the skills and some of the know-how about how to fit into the labor market. Now, when it comes to class, class is a topic or a concept that is very rarely discussed and grossly distorted when it is discussed. When it's mentioned, it's usually characterized as a demographic variable, and the title of the talk I think is interesting because it includes income, and that's a demographic a variable there. And what we hear about when we hear discussions of class are issues of lifestyle. You know, what do you do with your money? How do you display it or not? Status, income, for example. But class is really about power and how these social relationships play themselves out in the system of power that we have within this society. It is a dynamic interrelationship with politics and economics coming into play constantly. And it's not very visible, and it's also, I would say, not very sexy. It's not something that we like to talk about because there's a lot of complexity to it. But nonetheless, class power receives its definition in relation to other classes. That is, you can't have a class of people without having some contrast to it. So for example, if we look at it historically, you can't have slaves without plantation owners. You can't have workers without business owners, and so forth. Labor is a key element in class power, in the understanding of class structure. And labor is defined by its relationship to class power, which is conceptualized as a relationship of political and economic power to the production process. That is, where do you fit in within the production process in our society? You know, how much autonomy do you have? Do you take orders or do you give orders? Or do you fit somewhere in between, which a great deal of many of us do. That is, you know, we receive orders, but we also give orders. That is, we manage other people. We have some supervisorial authority. Now, the productive power of any society consists of manual, mental, and some combination of manual and mental labor. Wealth creates power, and labor creates wealth. So there is sort of this hierarchy or a strata that we see within society in terms of the class structure. So labor creates wealth, and wealth creates power, and that power is exercised by a very small minority in our society. So class power, therefore, refers to the amount and quality of power exercised in our social system. For example, the power over what goes on in a workplace. Who decides the rules? Who decides the scheduling? You know, what's behind those decisions? Because it isn't just a personal thing necessarily. There are imperatives to the operation of any given business or place of employment. And some of those decisions are figured out by the people in charge, but others even go up higher than that. That is, that there are necessities within society that compel said manager or said owner to enact a certain set of decisions for their business or place of employment to operate. Another example of class power is the power of taxation. Now, nobody likes taxes, right? The tax system in our society is very regressive. That is, that the heaviest burden falls on the people who earn the least. Now, we have a somewhat of a progressive tax structure when it comes to income. That is, that the more you make, the more you pay. However, some of the privileges granted to the people at the very top who earn a great deal, and I'm not even talking 100,000 or even 250,000. I'm talking now 7, 8, and now we're going into the billions. We have close to 300 billionaires in this country. And these are the people that are setting policy when it comes to taxation. So, for example, they earn more, but they also have loopholes, and they have tax credits and so forth that allow them to reduce their tax liability and sometimes to not pay any taxes. And that's incredible, right? For a multimillionaire or even a billionaire to not even pay taxes. And that is a reality that does play itself out. Another example of class power is the power to exercise your health. Now, there are over 47 million people today without health insurance. That is a national crisis. But the power structure in our society tolerates that. Not the people who are uninsured or even the 60 million who sort of go on and off health insurance throughout the year. They have no say-so other than if they can figure out or find a policy that may fit their economic capabilities. But the healthcare system is in a crisis, not because it doesn't do well, not because it has cutting-edge technology, which it does, and innovative research, which it does. We have the #1 healthcare system in the world. We also have the most unequal healthcare system in the world. Now, that seems contradictory, right? How can you have these two things fit together? Well, because the class power structure allows it to. That is, what is inputted into the healthcare system allows enough profit revenue to be generated to keep this industry afloat. Another element of class power would be the power to set social policy. Now, how many of us have access to, the powers that be, even here in Helena? In Washington, for example, there are over 30,000 lobbyists. How many of those do you think represent the working class, the poor, or even the middle class? Very few, if any, and I can probably run off maybe a dozen organizations that have some lobbying influence that represent these other classes. That is, about 85% of the population really does not have any influence or impact in Washington. About that much. And it's astonishing. And yet, we hear that our input into the democratic process is through elections. Well, that's one form of input, but that can't be the only input, right? Another example, the power to shape which ideas and values dominate our concerns. That is an important power, the power that we see in the media when ideas and values dominate our concerns. Why are we more concerned about, Britney Spears' baby than we are about the number of kids who don't go to college, let alone the number of kids who don't graduate from high school, or who don't, even after they enter into college, have a comparable literacy level? To do the work. And this is where the institution of education comes into play, because it fits within the realm of the ideas and values that dominate our concern. Now, we all consider education to be very important, right? And we're all here to further our education maybe for passionate reasons, maybe even for practical reasons. But our experience through college or through any level of education has already been pre-shaped. And this is where you begin to see this relationship, this dynamic between an institution as education and class as a set of social relationships. It's dynamic in the sense that it works largely to reinforce the status quo in just about every important area of life. Now, it isn't until we get to college that we sort of begin to explore and maybe have a little creativity and input into our learning process. But up until then, we're essentially passive learners. We are supposed to receive and then regurgitate there. So education has an effect, a socializing effect, that is essentially in support of the status quo, and this is how education and class play themselves out. First of all, it does socialize students into the work habits, into the attitudes, and into the values necessary for the different labor positions that we have within our society. And in this socialization, what we see, rather, are several elements. One is the obeyance of authority, right? You are supposed to respect your teacher. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that because I'm a teacher myself. However, it has a socializing effect in the sense that you don't necessarily raise your hand and question their assumptions or what they're talking about, largely speaking. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, but largely speaking, you are essentially to listen, write notes, and regurgitate this information. So you are also to carry out orders in a regimented fashion. That is, you're given an assignment, you're to complete it, then you're supposed to return it for evaluation. Very similar to a work environment in which you're given orders, you're supposed to complete it, you're evaluated for it, and part of your reward or compensation is income. It's not the only one. It involves other things such as benefits and even tenure for that matter. Education also stresses rote memorization. Again, this aspect of essentially learning the stuff or memorizing it rather, and then regurgitating it back. There is a lack of creativity and a lack of spontaneity in that. Now, we're beginning to see a change in that, but that still is largely held within the education system in our society. If you go to elite schools, they have a different conception of their curriculum. And what they want is actually the kids to think of choice and to be creative and to spontaneously, interject and so forth. We don't necessarily have that element within the public school system or the education system as a whole. And I don't know to what extent it's practiced in the college level, but certainly there is an opening there for students to give input and so forth. One other effect or aspect of this relationship is that it minimizes critical thinking. That a lot of the process of educating, essentially, again, going back to rote memorization, to carrying out orders, is essentially to do the task, to complete it, and to get it done and over with. And there is very little room in that process that, encourages nuances or complex analysis. We know that when we get to this level, that it involves a great deal of abstract thinking. And many students are astonished because all of a sudden they're like, well, why didn't I learn this stuff? And what essentially they're saying, not only are they interested in it, but they're also saying that I'm capable of learning this. And I'm only 1 or 2 years removed from high school. Why wasn't I learning this stuff before I got to college? So the effect essentially is to get along, to go along within the education system, and that is replicated out in the work environment. Education does create various kinds of competency and even skilled workers for the workforce, but it also legitimates the operation of our society by providing even the ideological justifications of inequality. That is, it justifies the inequality that we see. Why? Because I have my degree and they don't. I deserve more, they don't. Right? And so there's an added element to how we perceive other people, that is, in terms of our social relationships, and we begin to stigmatize them. And they don't have it, but I do, so I'm more worth than they are. They're less of a member in our society, you see. And education reinforces this form of inequality that we see, not just in income, but in terms of access to the important resources in our society. And even when you get into a higher education, there are still even elements of privilege that exist. So for example, people who go to the Ivy League schools, or to some of the big schools here on the West Coast, they feel that they have more privilege than you do. Now, is your education any less or inferior than theirs? And every educator would tell you, even on those campuses, no, it isn't. And in reality, it really isn't. That is, what you're receiving in content, the way you're being challenged, isn't really any different than in those schools. What is different, though, is the set of social relations that exist in those schools as opposed to this school or a comparable school. That is, the network is much bigger, and the network is tied into powerful elements within society that, who you know matters more than what you know, right? And that gets you into these positions of authority to reinforce the system in our society. All right, and with that, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Two-part question. The first, in no offense to any of the discriminatory talks or anything like that. The first is actually for this, I don't remember your name. Sorry. To Brian, and that is just a clarification question. But was LGBT at any time illegal?
Actually, so the question,
It's just a clarification question. It's not meant for any offensive or...
Sure. Oh, no. So the question was being LGBT, being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender ever illegal? And the answer actually is it still is. There are many states currently that have on their books laws prohibiting same-sex sexual behavior. Prosecution based on those laws has declined certainly since previous times, but same-sex sexual behavior has certainly been classified as illegal.
And then the second one is more of the clarification question, but the second one is, do you also represent other sexual orientations, for instance, multiple partner marriages, or any other, I guess you could call them weird sexual preferences?
So the question was, do I personally or do people
Are,
who...
are you advocating the discrimination or advocating the non-discrimination of those as well?
It's a really great question. So the question is, am I also advocating non-discrimination based on other sexual choices, or you would use the term sexual perversions, like multiple partners or other possibilities like that?
I don't mean to use the word perversion. I meant just, to get my point across.
It's a really interesting question that you're asking that, because I think that oftentimes people perceive someone asking for rights based on sexual orientation or non-discrimination based on sexual orientation as being part of a slippery slope that thereby may open up the door to polygamy, pedophilia, and other feared possible social consequences that people may have in their minds. I personally, in terms of my own work, I study sexual orientation and gender identity. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender identities are kind of the four categories of work that I study. And I'm a psychologist, not an advocate. So I'm not really promoting non-discrimination. I'm actually promoting more information and greater understanding of people. I think there's a lot of biases and misunderstandings based on both sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think I see the purpose of my work as educational as opposed to political, but I appreciate your question. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Julie. How can we as free educators help in this
Thank you.
promotion to aid you in being able to teach?
We'll call some legislators, email the legislators, call the legislators. She's asking what strategies or how can people assist in this effort. For one thing, I'm at the end of a tribal history project. We got 2 years of funding, and I'm just scratching the surface of history from time immemorial. I'm running around filming 2 of the last Salish speakers in our community. We have under 60 people that are Salish as a first language speakers. So there are 60 people that hold the collective memory and history of who we are, and most of those 60 people are over 50 years old. And so I am, it's not just the issue that we need to be literate and know this, but it's also a critical issue in time for all of the native language families in Montana. Even the Crow and the Cheyenne are now having children who are coming to school speaking English as a first language. And so all of our history and culture and memory is in our language. And our worldview is in our language. And so I'm trying to document part of that by going around and filming place names, which is telling me I'm learning about my Aboriginal territory. I'm learning about stories of landscapes and what we did there, what our relationship was like with that place. And so I'm learning this for the first time. To do that, the unfortunate thing takes money. Camera, gas. I was driving a vehicle with 212,000 miles on it. I don't know if it's going to go much further, but the legislature came up with this money, and then they said, okay, that's it. So, when it comes to math or science or things like that, there seems to be a greater resource, or reading and math are the big things in education today that they're pouring millions of dollars into. And so I think it's very important, but I think there's going to have to be some funding. So I guess, we forget about the idea of collective action, but I think the legislature will be responsive to people that aren't Indian. Because when I go there, and I've been there giving testimony, and it's like, oh, that's that Indian again. Here, that Indian is here again. She's going to talk about those Indian things. And it's seen as my agenda. But it's really everybody's agenda. Because my goodness, we're ready. I think everybody is so ready. I know teachers are ready. I get phone calls and emails all day long, letters. saying, can you help me? Can you give me this? I respond always to teachers and try to find support for them or give them materials or direct them to somebody. So collectively, lobby local schools, lobby the school boards, go to school board meetings, but certainly lobby the political powers that be. And if they see that this isn't an Indian issue, they're more likely to respond. So thank you for asking.
The first half of my question is for Julie. Have you been working with the OPI team at all and coming together with their information? I know they had a meeting on Tuesday that was talking about the Indian education and what we've been trying to do specifically here in Missoula with integrating Salish culture into the classroom.
Right.
And
Because
they-
this is our homeland.
Right, and that's what they were using as their foundation.
The Lewis and Clark School, and I've been there into a lot of schools in Missoula. I got to go to Willard. I got to go to Hellgate. I have to tell you that. I got to go to Hellgate High School. That was a high school that I dropped out of when I was a junior. It was very unfriendly to Indian people when I was there. And going in there today, it would never seem like it could be that way, but it was. That was a long time ago. So I got blessed in my life to go all the way back around and go back to that place and talk to teachers. But OPI is trying desperately to do the work. There's been some problems, I think, in the way they've done funding. They've been giving funding to schools where there aren't any Indian people, and then they're expecting those schools to develop exemplary materials. So guess what? The schools call people like me or somebody else, and they're like, can you help us? Because we have all this money and we want to do this, but we don't have the content. So I think it's kind of been a hurried mismatch to try to produce something very quickly to prove to the legislature that it can be done and that we can have a product. And I know they're under a great deal of pressure. And so some of the things have been wonderful and some of the things have been not so wonderful. And so I know that there are some videos that have some incorrect information, and that becomes problematic. I'm committed to the time to do this right, this time. So I have worked with some schools that have had OPI grants, and I know that they're working diligently and under a lot of pressure. I think they feel like they need, they're being called in to show, okay, we now have this book, 100 Facts on American Indians in Montana. No, I'm serious. And so they're trying to do some things really quick instead of having the time and the luxury and the value to do something really, really meaningful, to provide a rich, meaningful narrative where kids are going to really learn something. Not an ABC Indian book, but to really listen to deep, rich oral history, the kinds of things that promote understanding and that say a lot about who we are as Indian people, the things that personalize and humanize our history and who we are. And that's what we want, but it's not, we're in this fast food mode, and it's crazy making for me because I'm at the end of, and I'm trying to finish everything, so that was too long, probably way more than you ever wanted to know.
The other half of my question was for Professor Romero. When you were talking about integrating creativity and things like that, I just worry about no child left behind and the pressure as far as getting children from low to high all on the same page and getting them through the tests and things like that. And I grew up in Texas, so we were taught to the test, and that was exclusively the curriculum that we were given, and it's what I'm seeing happening across the country now. And trying to think back as far as how my teachers let us think and come up with solutions on our own, and worrying about how NCBL is going to push that farther and farther aside.
So your concern or your question deals with how this policy, No Child Left Behind, what effect it may have on children as they're educated, because they're being taught to test successfully on this policy. And Texas, by the way, was the test case there. started years ago, decades ago, actually. And Texas also has a history of using various forms of standardized tests in education to weed out people, and then to segregate them. So for African American and Mexican American students and some Native American students, suffered the brunt of this form of testing, as well as poor whites in Texas who were marginalized in the early part of the 20th century when this form of testing existed within Texas. So it has a place in history in terms of education and testing. But I think you're correct in that this policy leaves no room for creativity, for creative learning, and I think that that it really, in many ways, locks up the arts within school. Now, a lot of policymakers think that the arts are superfluous, that they have no value within, and they're looking at it in terms of economic value. What does it generate, Not really much. That is, if you look at it from that angle, which is accurate, I believe. However, what social psychologists understand about this aspect of education, that is, of being exposed to creativity in the arts and so forth, is that it does have an effect in terms of problem solving. And problem solving is something that you can apply in just about any area, right? And exposure to that, right? If you don't have that creativity, then you're going to be stunted, when confronted with multiple problems. People who have that socialized aspect within their education, do very well when it comes to problem solving, even if they're in a technical field like engineering. But you hear cases all the time about people leaving their professions that are very technical because they feel like they're a drone, and that there is no input. And that's part of the creative process, too. It's the ability to influence the very nature of work that you're doing rather than just replicating it day in and day out, of sort of stepping back and trying to come up with some better ways or other ways that are maybe even more humane that may take more time. But we live under a system in which efficiency is, probably the most important value that we can apply. And efficiency has its serious drawbacks, especially when it comes to dehumanizing people, because the profit imperative that is underlying this efficiency value ignores the reality of millions of people. And so you see how it filters down. We could say, well, if we fixed it, if we allowed creativity within schools, then our society might be better. And there may be some truth to that, but you really have to address the totality of the system. And that's really difficult. I don't have any answers for that. But I do feel that, yes, it does start in education, but it's not where we need to start and end. It needs to be in other important institutions around our lives in the society.
Can I say something?
Please.
Higher education needs to do a better job with teachers so that teachers are educated about research. A school where I was at were the National Reading Panel, and we have to teach reading that way, this report that was done. And they got a packaged reading program, and we were doing reading in a cultural context, a class, and they said, well, none of our teachers can take it because we have this packaged reading program and we've signed a fidelity clause. And it's like, I thought fidelity was about marriage, but I guess it's about schools and reading programs too. But none of the people that I was talking to had actually read that report. I read it, I printed it off, and I read it. And so I'm talking to a group of people who are advocating a report that they've never read. And that often happens in schools. Somebody is saying, this is research-based, and I'll say, well, what do you mean by that? What research? Who was it done with? What are you talking about? Well, I don't know, but it is, and by golly, that's what we're going to do. So I think higher education needs to really raise the bar for teachers so they can feel like a professional, so they can understand the research, so they can negotiate it, so they know what they're talking about. Because teachers could be very powerful force against No Child Left Behind, because it would be much more efficient to make schools humane, then kids might want to be there, to make learning fun, and to educate the other half of who we are with the arts.
This is for Dr. or Professor Romero also. So right now it seems that the No Child Left Behind tests are really good predictors of socioeconomic status. And I was just wondering if these tests remain how they are, do you have any suggestions for teachers to help students that maybe aren't in as high of a class, I guess?
So,
to do better?
so your question is, or you're bringing up is that the results that we're seeing from the tests coming from this policy are reflecting socioeconomic factors, right? And you're also asking what can teachers do to sort of mitigate some of the low end, I would imagine, right? I don't know what teachers can do. That is in the classroom. I'm not a pedagogist. I really don't know. I would like to know if anybody has any ideas on this, but it does reflect a really large problem. And one interesting thing that I read in regards to test outcomes is that there is a provision within the No Child Left Behind for exemptions. And interestingly, the Harvard University Civil Rights Project did an analysis of high schools and middle schools, that were applying for this exemption. And interestingly enough, a lot of them were suburbs of large cities that were predominantly white. And I don't know what the reason is, and they didn't speculate on that, but they did see a trend in terms of school districts and even schools themselves applying for exemptions, whereas the inner city schools, the reservation schools, the barrio schools weren't asking for those. Neither rural school districts were asking for those exemptions, if they were, they certainly weren't being granted. But what did show up is these suburban schools, and primarily in Texas, by the way. Again, they were the lead state in terms of the most number of school districts asking for exemptions, so that their funding wouldn't be subject to the outcome of their students testing on this. The one thing that I think that teachers can do, and that is outside of their classroom behavior, is that teachers have a lot of moral authority in our society. They spend more waking time with children than parents do today. And what they say, I think, has a lot of resonance, and it can't necessarily be articulated within the organizations or affiliations that they may be involved in. I think it also needs to be done, outside of that, representing, even if it's just a school or representing a school district, but in some collective fashion that really articulates what they're seeing and the interference of what they want to achieve with the policy, so there's problems there. And I think that if they articulate it, as has been coming out over the years since this policy was enacted, that their voices will be heard. But what I say is, or advocate for that matter, is that teachers assume that moral authority, because they really have a place in society, unlike most professions out there. I mean, they're in direct contact with children, all the time. And so they're not only a teacher, they're a security guard, they're a counselor. I mean, they fulfill multiple roles. And so I think they need to step out of just that classroom role and really assume that public role that they really have and speak out about policies that really don't educate.
Can I jump in? No, I'm coordinator.
I wanted to speak to my personal pain, being a low-income individual and trying to get into college and then to stay in college, and the difference between my experience and other students who are here who have access to more resources. It just pains me to no end to see people who can go to talks like this, who can attend the social events. I have to work, I have to take care of my child, I can't do the extra reading, and I just feel like there's a strata within this institution that follows what you were talking about with the prestigious West Coast or East Coast schools, the people being more connected and having access to more resources when they're done, or people with power. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, like any of you, if you have any ideas on how to begin to fight that structural classism that's even in our institutions. That was a long question.
What you're talking about, the structural strata or class strata that we see even on a campus such as UM is really reflective. It's a microcosm of society. And so you have multiple levels of privilege, even people from working class backgrounds and disadvantaged backgrounds who come here nonetheless have some form of privilege that their peers who aren't attending college don't have. But even within this environment known as a university, that there are also levels of privilege there. And that all goes back to where you were born. So the only way really to address that is for you to go back and select your parents in some metaphysical way, so you wouldn't be here. No, I'm really joking about that, because we don't select our gender, we don't select our race, we don't select our class position, really. We can sort of change that. We can sort of change our race and sort of change our gender, too. That's sort of happening now with technology. But class replicates class, so that the class you're born into, you're essentially going to die into. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't improve, anymore, because you can. But it does reflect, and that class stratification is almost like a caste system. There are modes of behavior and attitudes, that I see in my class with students from working class backgrounds are less likely to participate, even though I have that as a requirement. Middle class and some of the affluent students, no problem. They feel very confident about themselves, even if what they're saying is gibberish. Doesn't matter. They feel confident and capable, right? Whereas that experience of people from working class and even middle class backgrounds, they're a little more hesitant. They're a little more careful, right? And that's a class experience, an outcome of that. So I don't know how to address that necessarily, but that's what I see. And the problem is much bigger than we can localize here at UM. I mean, it can go statewide,
Well, I just think that I think that a lot of us have kind of been lulled into I don't know, being immobile or something, and I think that that the issue of class is everybody's issue, and poverty sucks. I've been poor, it sucks, and it's hard. And the largest growing population of the poor are children, the involuntary poor. And we should all be concerned, and we should all be active around those issues because they are our issues, and there should be people that are active on that issue on campus. And I would think that that certainly people who have power at this institution should be brought into the conversation, and that should be done collectively by people. And people that have power and that have resource have a particular responsibility to be part of that conversation. And we just really have to start being human beings with each other. And I keep thinking about this Hopi prophecy. Now, it's not a hey yana ho yana thing, I'm telling you. It's a real deal. No, it's something that these elders said, because we all wait for the next generation to make things better. You know, the 60s came, the civil rights, everything's great now, and the war on poverty, we didn't win that one because there's still, the gap is greater, is greater today, and there's no reason that children should be hungry, and there's no reason that people shouldn't have a place to live, and a safe place to live. And it's just a crime, and it just seems like we need to get worked up or something. I don't know what it takes to work us up, but whatever it does, we need to do that. And so we need to find allies and people of like minds and collectively act together. And we need to somehow make people see that it is their issue. I remember when I picked up the newspaper, and it was when the genocide was happening in Rwanda. And the little boy in the newspaper looked like my nephew. He looked like my nephew, Nathan. And I said, oh my God, you know, this little boy, you know, and I called a friend, her partner was in Rwanda. He was a correspondent. And I said, find out who's helping in Rwanda. You know, who's on the ground and doing something, you know, and I'll try to find people that will support some of those efforts. But somehow we need to figure out how to make these issues our issues and name them our relatives, you know, all children. Children are everybody's responsibility. And for some reason, we're not feeling that. And I talk to young people and say, what are your issues you're passionate about? Ooh, I don't know. Gee, I don't know. I don't know. You know, on SKC campus, it's a tribal college, but it's like, gosh, could you get someone riled up on something? Could you get staff to something? We had a speaker who's talking about modern Islam. I couldn't drag people out there. I said, do you think Montanans know a lot about it? How many Muslims have you met? What could you tell me about modern Islam? Is it playing a role in the world today? Should we know about it? Yeah, gosh, there were about 7 of us sitting there, you know? And I was like, what's going on? I had food, I'm putting food out there. I don't know. I just, we're missing something, or we've been lulled. We need to turn our TVs off and throw out the Nintendos and, you know, and all that stuff. I mean, we need to just really start using our anger and our compassion and our empathy intelligently. And so we need to start raising and encouraging compassion and empathy in our classrooms, on college campuses, in K-12 public schools. Young people do not get a certain age and all of a sudden become compassionate. That's something that we learn. That's something that we learn. And so it seems like there's a need for a revolution of spirit and soul. And I guess that starts with us. You know, that starts with me thinking about that and really thinking about what you said and thinking what could be done and what are the resources for people. What does this campus offer, and who are the powers that be that have something to do with that? But I'll ally with you. There's somebody in the back that's...
Oh, I want to ally too, I mean,
Okay.
in terms of what you're saying, because I was really struck by what you'd said about how we wait for the next generation, right? And how can we reverse that and actually think about how it is that, how do we want to be remembered by history? How do we want to be remembered by the future generations? Are we going to be remembered as being on the right side of history or the wrong side? You know, and so all of our actions today should be with that kind of long-term view in mind. Are we going to be remembered by history in the way that we want to be, or are we going to be kind of swept under the rug for being too cowardly, or actually voting on the side of injustice or perpetuating injustice in that sense? And I'm so heartened to see all these students here. I wish some of them were mine, but next time, maybe next year. And I was curious because I feel like, I mean, in this talk about privilege, right? I mean, so there's privilege and there are people who are going to be underprivileged. I mean, that's the kind of binary that we have set up here. And I was interested, Brian, in what you had said earlier about this idea of heterosexual privilege, and then continuing throughout the different talks about a kind of privilege, right? The privilege to ignore Native American history or ignore, the very founding of this university on very sacred tribal lands, right? And this idea that we can also ignore how class is so incredibly complex that it incorporates things that are not equated in dollar terms, but are in terms of social networks, or what kind of power, or whose ear you have, or what kind of influence you have. So I was curious, and I don't know if all of you can speak to this, or maybe just one or two, but how is it that we address the idea of privilege when it is usually couched in terms that if this group has privilege, or if this group, you raise them up in terms of privilege, it's a zero-sum situation, and that more equality for them means less equality for me, right? To be more fair means to be less fair to myself and to the people who I identify with as a group. So I was really struck by what you were talking about, Brian, earlier in terms of heterosexual privilege and the economic basis of it, right? There's an economic edge to it all. This idea that of heterosexual self-interest, that if we can deny people who are not heterosexual these kinds of benefits, then there's more for us, people who identify as heterosexual. Just as, in terms of class inequality, if we can recreate the class structure in the college campus, then people won't, they'll be sort of, oh, you're more privileged than I am, rather than asking, well, why is it that our government doesn't make education available for everyone at the kind of K through 16 level, as it does in other nations around the world. So I was just curious about how do we address that idea that it's always a kind of taking away from the group that's privileged? Because that doesn't seem to sell politically. We can talk about affirmative action, right? And this idea, oh, well, if we talk about Indian education for all, then that means less for math and sciences. Something like that, which is lucrative or puts us in a better place in the global market.
So many great points to respond to there. I think fundamentally it comes down to an issue of individualistic versus collectivistic societies. So if you see things as a zero-sum game, you're operating from an individualistic perspective in which you're thinking, what is going to be the cost to me if I were to become aware of someone else's plight in society? Privilege, one of the things that it does is that it affords people the benefit of being able to be ignorant of certain things. And being able to be ignorant of injustices in the world is a form of privilege. I really liked your comment about coming to college and feeling like you've been underprivileged. And you haven't had the option of being aware that there are people of different socioeconomic statuses here at the university. It's just been part of your reality. But it's very possible to be in a place where you don't have to think about it, and that's a type of privilege as well. So I think it really involves a value shift from looking at things from an individualistic perspective to thinking, how can we serve the greater good, and how can we recognize this theme that we keep coming back to, that being in a position of privilege has its disadvantages as well. And I think it's hard for people to recognize that because it's difficult to take other people's perspectives.
And it would seem like, if we think about the world today, and if we talk about the condition that we're in, and we look at, continuing our behaviors in an individualistic way is really a losing proposition for everybody. And so if we can start talking about it like that and thinking about it like that societies and communities, and what is a community, and thinking of creating communities where we are. Creating a community where we are. I used to think about that in my classroom. I'm going to create a community, and we start doing that wherever we are. Like in here, it would have been nice if we could have had time to create a community, and be human beings with each other, and for me to learn something about you and be able to do that. I think that we just have to make a personal commitment in our professional life and our personal life to do that and to talk about it and to raise our kids with that kind of idea and thinking and to look at that and to find examples of places where people are doing that. It's really beautiful. It's, at home for me it's wonderful and sometimes it's horrible. being in a community because everybody knows your business. Everybody knows what I'm doing. My love life is a hot topic right now, I'll tell you. Came up at the elders meeting, I heard. So there are things like that that are unfortunate. But on the other hand, there are things that are so amazing and so wonderful. That people have the memory of all my relatives. That we have the memory of each other. That we have the memory of songs, of language, of place. That's a privilege I have. To be so connected to a place that I could go back and back and back and back and back and back and back. That I could go somewhere and stand there and know who was there thousands of years ago. What a privilege that is. And so if we think about that, creating community, I think creating community is powerful. And sometimes some of the things we need to do seem so simple. They seem like cliche phrases, but I really believe in those things, because I think that our greatest power, is our own humanity. And sometimes it gets lost in policy or intellectual exercise. And we can intellectualize it, and maybe we need to start thinking more with the heart. And that's a phrase in our language. It's you're thinking, when somebody says something particular, you say, you're thinking with your heart. And I think that's a good thing. And I know people don't like to talk about that touchy-feely stuff. Perhaps in academic institutions it's not acceptable, but I think we need to talk about it more. I know in high schools, young people are dying to talk about it, what it means to be a human being in the world today. Not just for us, but for the place where we live. The land and the water and all of those things. What does it mean to be a human being living in this landscape? It's not just how I talk with you or you, but it's how I live out on that landscape. So, thoughts and ideas.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming. It is past 9 o'clock, so I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate the topics of discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying.